Well, Floridians, watch out for falling dominoes this week. Hi, it's Matt Mitchell, editor of Alachua County's edition of RedCounty.com with a new video edition of Election Pulse Florida. We're going to be talking today about the Florida governor's race, which is becoming the race of focus now after the Senate race last week in the primary between Governor Charlie Crist and former State House Speaker Marco Rubio got all the attention. Well, a couple of older folks are getting some news of their own. Last week, Chief Financial Officer and Tampa Bay resident Alex Sink declared her candidacy for the Democratic nomination for governor to a group of supporters and on Facebook and Twitter. And today, at a small rally in Orlando, former Congressman and current Attorney General Bill McCollum announced that he would be running for the Republican nomination. He was joined by Republican Party of Florida Chairman Jim Greer and a Lieutenant Governor Jeff Kottkamp, who is a Cape Coral resident and looking to run for Attorney General rather than be Attorney General McCollum's running mate. McCollum's an interesting figure. He served in Congress representing the Orlando area for about 20 years. He was one of the coordinators of the impeachment vote against Bill Clinton in the House of Representatives and has a solid record on fighting terrorism, or at least holding hearings about terrorism and making military issues a big deal, which could come in handy when talking on the campaign trail to the state of Florida, but image is important as well, and he has some issues with image that are plaguing a lot of our older politicians in Florida today. He is part of a certain generation of Florida politician that did well in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but in the late 90s and 2000s and beyond may be a little bit anachronistic. He is a middle-aged white man with a southern accent. He was born and raised in Hernando County before going into the Naval Reserve and becoming a lawmaker. And having been in politics for 30 years, that may be a little bit of an issue with him. That is somewhat tempered by his opponent, Chief Financial Officer Sink. She is also in her 60s and has a bit of an accent herself, but she is female, obviously, and she is at least sold as someone who can appeal to independents, whereas Attorney General McCollum strikes a more conservative streak. Whether that is based in whether that affects McCollum's message or marketability remains to be seen. What is seen right now in both parties is an interesting development in that both are going out of their way to try to make Sink and McCollum their candidates of choice and try to limit as much of a damaging primary as possible. And this is not too much of a surprise when you consider the state of the economy. One thing that you don't really hear talked about a whole lot is how the economic downturn is affecting donor behavior in political campaigns. And when it comes, and primary campaigns are expensive anyway, especially when they're competitive, but when you have a situation where the amount of money available is depleted, the incentive to actually have major competitive primaries goes down quite a bit. And that is an undercurrent that informs a lot of the Republican Party of Florida and the Florida Democratic Party's efforts to limit competitive primaries. Not necessarily as much with the Senate primary on the Republican side. There may be some fears that Governor Crist will have a hard time beating Rubio in a primary that people aren't talking about. There may be some internal polling that we're not hearing. But other than that, there is definitely an incentive to avoid expensive primaries for both parties. In 2004, when former Congressman McCollum ran against Mel Martinez for the Republican nomination for Senate, they tried to make it as orderly a primary as possible by having President Bush, the NRSC, and other players come out and endorse Martinez, and he ultimately beat him in the primary. But the problem is it depleted Martinez's resources so much that Betty Castor very nearly beat him. You saw the same thing 2 years later in Rhode Island when Mayor Steve Laffey ran against Lincoln Chafee for the Republican nomination in Rhode Island and practically bankrupted Chafee's campaign, and in the end of the day he lost to Sheldon Whitehouse. These things are very expensive, and the mission statement of political parties and campaign committees is to elect members of their party, and that's the driving motivation. It's not necessarily principles or values. They have a mission statement that they have to fulfill in order to remain relevant, and that's kind of the motivation that you're seeing from Greer in his efforts, which even he called unusual steps, to make sure the RPOF endorses McCollum, even though he has some issues with his image and his potential message that could make this race very difficult. But even without McCollum, even with a different candidate, say a Vern Buchanan or Rick Baker, both of whom said they are not running, there are issues that the Republican Party is facing. The Republicans in Tallahassee had a heck of a hard time passing a budget in this last session. There was a lot of problems going on about that, and I think and you always have to remember the Republican brand has soured nationwide and in Florida. And these combined with the supposed moderate streak of Mrs. Sink, and put all those things together, and Mrs. Sink becomes a more formidable candidate than she might have been 6 years ago or even 4 years ago. And that's something you'll have to contend with. And in the Sarasota Herald Tribune today, Jeremy Wallace quoted a whole lot of Republican consultants throughout Florida that called McCollum a status quo candidate. He's paid his dues. He's going to win it whether we like it or not. There's a feeling that, he's experienced, he's a known quantity, and we'll just take our risk with him. Enthusiasm for him doesn't seem to be nearly as high as it is for other candidates. Certainly they're more enthusiastic about Crist for Senate, but they feel like he can raise the money. He's been here before, but he's still the target of some jokes from the Democratic Party. The Florida Democrats released a press release over the weekend saying, "Happy 14th run for office, Mr. McCollum." And of course they forget to mention that in his previous 13s he's won 11 of them, which is a hell of a record for any public servant, let alone someone who's been around since the 1980s and has proven very recently that he can still win. So that race is going to be very competitive. It's a long go. Both candidates can go through the issue, raising money, and the keys to victory for McCollum is to show that he can appeal to independent voters, Democrats in North Florida, and while not alienating his conservative base. His big issue is, he represented the I-4 corridor in the 1980s as a congressman, but it was a different I-4 corridor than what you have now. It's much younger, it's a little bit more affluent, and much less good old boy-ish. And can he appeal to the larger demographics of women voters and Hispanics, groups where Republicans have started to have trouble over the past few years? And you win and lose your races on the I-4 corridor here in the state of Florida, and if he can do that, he can win. But he is going up against a candidate who, at least in terms of image, is well suited to those demographics. So we'll see. It's going to be a very interesting 18 months. You'll have to watch and see if anybody tries to buck the party line and run against these people for the primary. It doesn't seem likely. The most likely on the Republican side is Agriculture Commissioner Charles Bronson, but he is not as well known. He has nothing to lose. He's a term-limited cabinet official, but he's not a known quantity like Attorney General McCollum is, and he may land up backing out under party pressure. So that's an interesting idea there. And the other minor cabinet races, those are some developments there. Lieutenant Governor Kottkamp is considering running for Attorney General, and tomorrow expect Senate President Jeff Atwater from Miami to declare for Chief Financial Officer. But we'll get to those developments over the course of the week, and I hope to see you next time for a new video edition of Election Pulse Florida. And please follow us and keep in touch with us on redcounty.com. I'm Matt Mitchell, and this has been a new edition of Election Pulse Florida. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.